So here we are. This is the beginning of Lent. It's supposed to be the time when we prepare ourselves for Holy Week, for Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, his betrayal, his crucifixion, his resurrection. And in the past, when I was growing up, Lent was a time when you had to give up something. You punished yourself for the guilt and sin of the past so that you could be purified when you got to Holy Week. We punished ourselves typically by depriving ourselves of something that we loved, like chocolate or meat. Or if you were really smart, you could punish yourself by refusing to eat stewed kumquat for the rest of the time. When one of my first jobs, I worked at a radio station in Vancouver, and I know you're not supposed to say these things anymore, but the boss's secretary was gorgeous. Well, I was in my 20s, I was still, riding high with hormones, so I noticed those things. And then one day, one spring, she showed up and she was just plain dowdy. I didn't know what had happened, so I went to, I had made friends with a couple of the older announcers, and they sort of took me under their wing the way, like eagle's wings, and helped me learn about stuff. And I said, what happened to her? And he just shrugged and said, oh, she's a Catholic. She's given up makeup for Lent. It's 60 years later. I can say for sure that that's not what Lent is about. And I think the reason for this reading that Fran gave us about Jesus heading off into the wilderness tells us what Lent is about. Usually that reading, the preacher focuses on the kinds of things that the devil is supposed to have tempted Jesus with. Physical stuff, like food. Power, like getting control over all the nations. Or some sort of supernatural act that is going to just awe the people and make them follow you. And incidentally, you might watch in the forthcoming election campaigns how often they will offer you physical things like handouts, tax benefits, and so on, or try to awe you with leadership or whatever. The same temptations that were applied to Jesus are still going on in an attempt to buy us. But I want to set those temptations aside, because to me the important thing is that Jesus came up from the Jordan River and immediately went out into the desert. And he went out into the desert where there were no roads, no settlements of any kind, and no Tim Hortons or McDonald's. He was on his own, and he was there for a purpose, to clear his mind of all the preconceptions. I mean, if this was a surprise for him, that the Spirit of God came down like a dove, and if he realized that he's called upon to go out and to be a Messiah to these people, what are the expectations of a Messiah? He's probably heard about this in the synagogue. They've told him what a Messiah is going to be doing. They've laid out the task, and now he wants to know, is this right? Is this the right thing? I find this guy that Jim Hanna used to quote all the time, Richard Rohr, does a daily blog, and in one of them he had some really good suggestions for how to read the Bible. He says the first thing to look for is the literal meaning. What happened? The second thing to look for is the underlying meaning. What's going on underneath this? pretty easy. The next two things are a little bit harder. Look at it comparatively. Look back and see, how has this theme been dealt with before in the Bible? Because the Bible stories repeat themselves over and over in different ways. And so if you can see how it was done before, that might give you a clue what's going on this time. And then the fourth level is, what difference does this make to you? So it becomes personal. In this story, Jesus going into the wilderness, into the desert, the first part is quite easy. Yeah, Jesus went into the desert, that's it. That's the only facts there are there. The second level, I think, is fairly clear because he has his preconceptions tested and he rejects the easy answers. So that's the underlying thing. But then the comparative. The other biblical stories about deserts, I mean, I'm not sure how familiar you are with these, but think about it. Moses met God in the desert at the burning bush. When the Israelites escaped from Egypt, they spent 40 years in the desert. So the desert was clearly a factor that shaped them as a people who were going to be able to come into the promised land. It toughened them. It gave them some discipline. And I'm not going to say it eliminated it, but the people who had been slaves had all died out by the time they got to the promised land. So there weren't people around anymore who expected somebody else to tell them to go fetch that bucket of water or cook this meal. They had to make their own decisions. There are a lot more. Ezekiel's dry bones. The valley of dry bones, Ezekiel saw. No, that's a wheeler rolling. Oh, dem bones, dem dry bones. They would have to be in the desert to be that dry. And the bones came to life in the desert. We had also, a few weeks ago, Isaiah's vision for the desert. And he said, the desert shall rejoice and blossom. And he said, when the Messiah is coming, you build a highway for him, where? Through the desert. Through the wilderness. That's where it comes from. When I put those together, it says to me that the people of Israel, the Hebrews, had a long tradition of expecting the desert to go to the place you go to declutter yourself, to get rid of everything that you've taken for granted. And when there is nothing there, you have to start making sense of it. It's not just the Bible. You remember, some of you who are my age will remember a song. I went through the desert on a horse with no name. It was good to get out of the rain. In the desert, you can
remember your name.
You can remember your name, 'cause there ain't nobody for to give you no pain. You see, there's the desert, that cleansing element again. I was wondering if Colleen Moody would be here this morning, because she and Jim often went down to Death Valley. And Jim said that he loved Death Valley because it was life stripped to its bare essentials. You don't pack any extra baggage if you're going walking in Death Valley. You take just what you really need. And those of you who have read Jan Phillips' books and heard her workshop, you remember it was in Death Valley that she had that life-changing experience. She was taking a picture at the front of her car, and somebody smacked into the back of the car at 75 miles an hour. She talks about being in the air and seeing the car in the air beside her, and the next thing she knows, she's underneath the car, she's trapped. And these two guys pull up and they come over and they look underneath at her and they say, "We'll go and get some help." You remember her line?
You
are the help. And that has been reshaping her ministry, her workshops, ever since. So in our lives, deserts are also important factors. That's why I ask you, this is the fourth question. What does this mean to you? Richard Rohr's question. How does this affect you? It seems to me that the story of Jesus going into the wilderness as the first Sunday in Lent is clear the clutter. Don't take anything for granted. Think about what is absolutely essential for you. And I'm talking about faith and church and life and that kind of thing. What's the minimum baggage that you can take with you? You see, Jesus could have come up out of the Jordan, seen the Spirit of God descending on him, and just gone back to Nazareth and resumed his carpentry business. Gotten married, had a bunch of kids, and that would have been the last we'd ever have heard of him. But he didn't. He came up from the Jordan and he went straight away out into the desert and he sorted things out for himself. And he realized that he had to make a fresh start. He had to do things differently. He had to follow a different path. He had to follow a path that eventually led him to Jerusalem. And all that goes on there, which I won't go into. It seems to me that's the point of Lent for us. To examine ourselves, to examine the spiritual baggage that we are carrying around, the certainties that we might need to reconsider, to lighten our load so that we can follow his example. And as we move through Lent, I don't think necessarily the answer is that we're supposed to go and get nailed onto a cross. But we need to go and find out what life has ahead of us without dragging along 3 suitcases. We have to travel light. We have to examine ourselves. We go into our own wilderness and see where it leads us.